Um, so welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Peter Botticelli. For those of you who don't know me or are new to SynTouch, again, welcome. I'd like to just very quickly go over the format for today. So we'll have a presentation that will target about somewhere between 30 and 35 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, somewhere between 25 to 30 minutes to try to keep this to just about 1 hour in total, considering everyone's time. You all should have a couple of radio buttons and boxes on your webinar screen for the Q&A section there. You can feel free to ask questions along the way, or reserve them for the Q&A. But we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. Another thing from the logistics side is that the slides, as well as this meeting, will be recorded and distributed sometime later on during the week. So no need for frantic screenshots or frantic notes. Everything will be sent out to you hopefully before the end of the week. The Q&A section is anonymous as well, so you will see a question, but you will not disclose your identity when you ask that question. So do feel free to ask the question, knowing that your identity will not be disclosed when you ask that question. It will be anonymous to all other users. So we do encourage lots of different questions, and going to go ahead and get started. So from a high level, we want to discuss objectively finding the ideal feel for a wipe, the tactile feel for a wipe, and we'll discuss SynTouch a little bit. We will discuss our technology a little bit, and we will dive into a specific case study regarding a wipe. So if we think about these two questions, these are going to be our guiding questions for the purpose of today's discussion. Question one, how should a wipe feel? And question two, how do we activate question one? How do we make the wipe feel like that? How do we make it feel that desired way? If we think about touch, tactile perception, haptics, as many of us refer to, we want to think about why it's important and why it matters to us. When we touch something, when we interface with something, it causes a very high emotional response in humans, and it's going to have a large effect on our product ownership. When we touch something, we feel like it's ours. When we browse for something in a store and we touch it, we get this sense that, you know, we're kind of trying it on or touching it, and we're starting to own it. We're starting to subconsciously and consciously connect that the touching of this object is building a sense of ownership, is building emotion around that perception. But that's not the whole picture. Tactile perception is going to be affected by much more than just the haptics, or just much more about what we touch. As we touch, or as we interface with those materials, with this wipe, with this shirt, with this product in a store, we have the sight, the smell, the sound, the taste. All of our other sensory inputs are being excited. We have the perception of maybe the packaging. We have the visual cues. We have the auditory cues. We have where it's placed on the shelf. We have all of these different elements that are building this sort of perception of our object, or of our sensations here. We have active versus passive touching. So am I touching something actively? Am I exploring it? Am I manipulating? Or is this an object that is touching me, whether that be on the hands or a different part of the body, and in different ways to interpret that different types of touch and build that picture of tactile perception. There are many different factors that distinguish us as individuals, right? Our age, our gender, our culture, our region, that all play a part in this touch, and our need to touch, right? Are we one of those people that are really comfortable just buying something online and being confident we're going to know what it feels like, or do we need to touch it? Are we more inclined to touch every single shirt on the rack as we walk through a store, or simply grab only the one we that interests us, right? So a number of different aspects that are going to build and complete this picture of tactile perception. So we have on the top of this slide here, we have product feel, and we talked a little bit about tactile perception, but we're also going to talk about consumer preference. So which wipe or which product do I prefer? Which one do I want to buy? Which one have I purchased in the past? And we can see that that sort of drives this little seesaw downwards, and what might drive in the opposite direction are things behind the scenes, things that we all may be interested in from a manufacturing or marketing perspective. Considerations to performance, considerations to cost, whether that's cost to manufacture or the purchase price, the time to market, as we, the wipe developer or product developer, need to launch, iterate, and produce a product. And more recently, we've seen a very large push in the sustainability. So as we move closer and closer to a circular economy, and as we as a society continue to reevaluate our footprint on the world around us, and how making things like consumable wipes, like electronic devices, like other products that we use in our daily lives, how that affects the sustainability of not only those products, but the larger picture. So we constantly have this compromise and this balance that we try to maintain. And while I would argue that the points sort of that represent that upward facing arrow and under that manufacturing and market are more familiar and better understood, we often have a very difficult time understanding the product feel, understanding the tactile perception, and understanding the consumer preference. We have a partial picture, we have some information, but we may not have the complete picture and the total realization of all the different elements and all the different nuances that go into having a complete picture of that product feel. So to help us build that, to help us fill in the blanks, if we will, we want to think about three different areas, three different sort of components that will allow us to create this construct that will fill in our understanding, fill in those gaps. We can see that the yellow colored bubbles represent our haptic assessments. So we can leverage SynTouch technology and some of the equipment and services that we offer to perform objective tactile measurements that will help us fill in some of the objective data that we may have been lacking in the past. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into that shortly. We talk about the red or orange bubbles here in the terms of framework. So how is our problem framed? How are we talking about it today? Are we thinking about things like softness? Are we talking about perception of quality? Does something feel cheap? Does something feel expensive? Does wipe A feel better than wipe B? These are the types of frameworks that we want to keep in mind as we approach our problem and attempt to apply our technology to the solution. And zooming out just a little bit to sort of our blue, bubbles here, we have supply chain integration. And again, we'll touch on each one of these in more detail as we move forward through the slides. We will try to tackle and explore the different elements of our supply chain up and down. So when we make a product, well, not all of us are always vertically integrated. Not all of us have control over every single element, every single component of that product, whether that be the raw materials, whether that be the distribution, the production, the nth number of steps that occur between inception on a whiteboard to a product on a shelf, right? There is a a large number of different things up and down the supply chain, different vendors and companies that we want to be able to effectively communicate and balance those different items in the sort of that seesaw that we saw in the previous slide. So we start to think about and to build out a little bit more of that framework, a little bit more of the construct around what we want to accomplish and what we want to do. We have some product questions, and this is going to start to build our use case or our case study, if you will. And these are some of the things that maybe most of us are faced with on a daily basis. How does the feel of wipe A compared to wipes B and C, my product against my competitor's product or other products that I've previously made? Which wipe is the softest? And again, softest can be adjective of your choice. Which wipe is the smoothest? Which wipe is the most luxurious? Which wipe is the fill in the blank? Is there a difference between machine direction and cross directions, the top, the bottom? So we are producing materials that may feel different depending on how the user interfaces with them. What are the differences between wet and dry wipes, right? A lot of times we are placing these wipes in a solution, or these wipes are containing a solution. How much of that solution is the right amount versus what solution is the right solution? There are lots of different considerations. And all of these different, again, compromises and adjustments that we make will build and will affect the feel. Which wipe do consumers prefer? Why? As we start to build that understanding, can a feel of a wipe be predicted before we manufacture it? Can we start to get more proactive in our approach to development rather than reactive? When we learn that and when we have that feedback, how can we reformulate? How can we change what we may already have or adjust a process that exists today to achieve that desired feel or move the needle closer to where we want? And how do we balance haptics with cost, sustainability, and performance? We completely understand that in a perfect world, in the SynTouch world, we could just do all things good, nothing bad, right now for no money. But the reality is that we understand that you have other considerations and that haptics needs to slot in appropriately. And we know that up until this point, talking to a lot of you and a lot of other folks in different industries, haptics has not always been part of the conversation, and it becomes difficult to fold haptics into the conversation without overbearing or without neglecting the hard work that's gone into, let's say, cost, sustainability, and performance, among other factors, up until this point. And certainly, last on this list, but certainly not limiting, how can we help with quality assurance? So Pack A versus Pack B, maybe you've got multiple production lines, maybe multiple locations in the world. Maybe it's the same product sold under different white labels or different brands. Being able to effectively give us a language, a specification, a tolerance in which we can communicate about the feel of a product, rather than a bunch of us sitting around a conference room table saying, well, it doesn't feel right, and it might feel right, not quite the same. So these are the product questions that I really want everyone to keep in their mind. And if one, two, or more really jumped out at you, as we go through our case study, I really want you to kind of envision this question, write it down, and work with that question as we go through this study so that you can kind of get a demo or sort of an idea of what it would be like to take this question from just that, a question, to an answer, to something that we can work with it. So again, we've got our product question representing our little pondering man there in our first bubble, and we want to take that and start to progress it to fill in that framework that we talked about in those previous slides. We've got in the middle there our SynTouch Takare. You can see a picture of the instrument at the bottom of the screen. This is a haptics measurement device that SynTouch manufactures to collect objective haptic data on all sorts of materials today, specifically wipes. And so we'll perform and design a number of different experiments on many different wipes, and that will, the structure of that experiment and that data collection will be based on that product question, and we can see where that product question is going to drive the activation of that data and the solution all the way through. And the square, the bubble to the right here, is data analysis, correlation, visualization to answer that question. So the structure of the experiment is such that we're going to produce data that can be visualized, manipulated, and adjusted in such a way that we're not just collecting data for data's sake, but we're collecting data that will lead us to an answer, that will deliver value to that question. And that's what we want to be able to do. I have a small video here that's going to play, and we can see just a SynTouch technician taking us through a testing of a automotive material. Here we have a knitted diamond pattern fabric. You can see some other samples, and here we can have a visual of the SynTouch instrument interfacing with a piece of cream colored leather here. In this case, we were testing some automotive interior materials for a client. I'm going to play that video one more time. I know that bandwidth may be an issue with some of these presentations, so please forgive the repetitiveness, but you can see we place our samples on magnets. This isn't the only way to test things, but it's one that works quite well for a lot of different fabrics. And we have our biomimetic tactile sensor, our little green finger that accurately represents the way in which humans capture and record information. So we're very biomimetic in this process. We'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. But we collect all the same types of information that people collect in the same way. The output of our instrument yields 15 unique dimensions, or parameters, if you will, that break down into 5 parent categories. We can see these parent categories listed here, and we've got a visual representation on the screen of the comparison of 4 unique materials. So each material is represented by a different color in this radar or spider chart. You can see that we have a light green, both a light and a dark blue, and a red material being compared here. And in many of the different dimensions or axes of touch, these materials are quite similar, making them a bit difficult for people to perhaps reliably discern and tell the difference between. However, we can also see that in some of the dimensions, in some of the axes, we have some subtle differences, and that's where we're going to be able to leverage the objective repeatability of the SynTouch measurement equipment in order to allow the activation of that data and furthermore delivery of the value. We're going to be able to answer that question. Here's the difference. We're able to measure it. We're able to measure it reliably and repeatably. And with that information, we can answer the question, what's the difference between wipe A and B, and what do we need to do to wipe B to make it feel like wipe C, etc. So we touched a little bit when we were watching the video there about the biomimetic measurements and what that means. And so I wanted to kind of touch on maybe some of the approaches that you all and SynTouch use and have used up until this point. So primarily we find that one of 2 approaches is commonly leveraged. The first being sort of standard tribology and first principles engineering measurements. And these are excellent pieces of equipment that give us precise engineering measurements, but tend to not be particularly correlated with human perception, right? I can measure something like temperature, for example, and I can have the most precise thermometer in the world, and I can get a really nice reading to the nth decimal place. But if I go to let's say a conference room table or a conference room chair, and I feel the fabric or the leather on the bottom of that chair, it might feel quite warm to the touch. If I grab the metal leg of that table, it will feel quite cold. And if I take out that, again, precise engineering measurement, that thermometer, the 2 are in fact at the same temperature. but one feels cold and one feels warm to people, because the way in which people perceive the world is a little bit different than our tribology equipment typically measure. Right? We don't interface with the world with a steel ball. We use our fingers, and our fingers are compliant. They are deformable. They're heated, right? And they are fluid filled. And so that is the mechanical properties of our biotech sensor, and our system as a whole emulates the physical properties of people. And so we're able to mimic that physical interaction that we have. On the other side of things, many of you may be leveraging human fingers or humans as instruments. And while humans are exceptionally correlated to their own perception, they are highly imprecise. They're not very repeatable, and we're biased, we're subjective. We have subconscious tendencies, we have information, we have an inability to orthogonally separate our senses. So if we're rubbing along a very smooth surface, but we hear audible noise or scratching sounds, we may say that something is rougher than it actually is, because we're hearing that sensation. And there are a number of different cost benefits to not using rooms and rooms and rooms of sensory panels in order to get a big enough sample size to kind of be able to tune out some of that noise. So again, we want to walk through these sort of the flow. We talked quite a bit about the blue circle in the previous slide, that 3-step process where we take a look at objective tactile perception. We want to take the output of that and feed it into our product perception, feed it into that human opinion, because we'll never be able to completely eliminate the human from the process, right? We can measure a bunch of different, if we take a visual analogy, we could measure a bunch of different color blues. We could tell you how those blues are different, why they're different. Again, objectively, what we need to do to blue number 1 to get it to look like blue number 2. But we still can't pick your favorite color. We can't tell you what's good and what's bad. That's where the consumer feedback, that's where the relative field and subject matter experts will allow us to guide what is something like a luxurious feeling automotive interior may not be a luxurious feeling handbag, may not be a luxurious feeling diaper, right? That word is going to mean something very different given the context, given the application. And carrying that all the way to the right-hand side, that red or orange bubble of consumer preference is where we're going to be able to leverage consumer panels, market research. Again, you likely go through some form of this process here today. And what we want to underline and what we want to deliver as a message is that the more testing that we do inside the blue bubble, the more objective tactile information we gather, and the better that we can apply that, the more confidence we can have in the orange bubble, the more confidence and predictiveness we can have in that orange circle by doing less of what happens in the green circle, right? We'll never be able to eliminate the green circle, it's there, but the idea is that we can have more and more confidence in that orange circle, in that last step of what our customers are going to prefer. And again, being able to be a bit more proactive in our approach instead of just reactive. I mentioned I would touch just a little bit on the supply chain. I kind of mentioned it before, different types of steps, different types of behaviors and interfacing that we would have with different folks that are involved in the process. The way we like to think about this, the way we like to think of ourselves, is that SynTouch is and can provide the language of touch to guide haptic outcomes, to guide discussions. And I've drawn the arrows here in a clockwise circle, but there are more things around this circle than I've listed, and you can feel free to draw the arrows in any direction, clockwise, counterclockwise, skip across the circle, skip to. Really, the idea is that once we have a universal language that we can all harmonize to, the conversations become frictionless, right? We're able to very efficiently communicate what our products feel like, what they should feel like. Again, those first two questions on slide number 1, it really makes answering those two questions much, much easier. So I talked about a case study, and we want to talk about sustainability, the need for a wipe redesign. So we're going to walk through this, again, keeping that product question that may have resonated with you from that list in mind. This case study could apply, this process can apply to your question as well. But if we think about the need for a wipe redesign driven by a recent sustainability push, we have a wipe that sells very well, and we're afraid, or there is an introduction of risk in changing the feel of that wipe, but we have an opportunity to maybe increase market share, or a mandate that we have to change that wipe because of perhaps an ingredient that we're using or a chemical that no longer meets the sustainability objectives of the organization or current legislation. So step 1 is kind of designing the study to optimize that sustainability, the cost, the time to market, the competitiveness, right? We can't completely eliminate everything else from that seesaw, that balancing act that we were talking about earlier, but we want to make sure that the feel of the wipe is included right at the beginning, so that we don't arrive at a scenario in which we've redesigned everything and we love everything about it except for the feel, right? We have to consider feel right at the beginning. Step 2, as we talked about in that blue bubble earlier, we'll take that and we'll take and capture that objective data on maybe the prototypes, maybe the competitors' wipes, maybe the current wipes. Again, really going to vary on the design of the experiment. We will obtain human opinion on those products and try to work with you, whether that's internally, externally, whether with your current customers or potential customers, to perceive those wipe perceptions and preferences. Build a correlation between the Takare data, objective data that we've collected, and start to build and start to construct predictive models and predictions so that we can have good confidence in that last step, that orange bubble that we showed earlier, to be able to drive that decision and be able to build that confidence that we have as we move through this process. If needed, we can reformulate those prototypes and repeat steps 2 and 4 with fewer human panels. So this is where the real efficiency gain can come into play, and this is where the real inception and the real kind of new territory that SynTouch can bring to what's happening in your current process and how we can improve it, right? So this is probably something that happens right now and is generally quite painful, the reiteration. But if we can do that sort of iterations and improvements and predictive feedback without actually having to take a prototype all the way to market or to bring something all the way to the finish line just to figure out, hey, we got it wrong, we've got to backpedal 3, 4, 5 steps. The idea here is that we want to spend as much time as necessary in sort of this step 5 area, so that we can feel confident that when we move forward from here, it's very unlikely that we'll then have to find ourselves backpedaling. And that's really our hope and our goal in spending our effort here in stage 5. And then once we move past that in stage 6, our data ensures that the wipe feel is going to be maintained from sourcing, manufacturing, and QA. So once we nail it in the lab, once we've kind of decided on what we want, now as we source materials, as we run our nonwovens line, as we add the different solutions to that wipe, as we change the packaging or have one line in Asia versus another line in North America make that product, we can really make sure that we're leveraging that language of touch the whole way along, so that something doesn't get lost, and that we know that we are delivering exactly what was in the lab gets delivered to the customer at the end. So I have just a ending slide here up on the screen. There is a link you can see at syntouchinc.com/020. We'd like to continue the conversation with all of you individually also here. So please feel free to start sending in some questions to the Q&A, but definitely to further that dialogue and to build on that, we'd encourage you to head to syntouchinc.com/020 and just fill out a quick contact form, and we'll be in touch privately if there's something that we can help advance this. All right, so we've got a few questions coming in here, which is great. I've got a question that says, does fragrance have an appreciable effect on feel? And generally we find that it does. Our olfactory or our sense of smell can influence how things feel. Certainly, if you have a very pleasant smelling product like a natural leather, we can say, oh wow, that that feels luxurious, or we can build that sense of luxury. I'm thinking about something like a premium automobile, and vice versa. If we had an unpleasant smell or a smell that was quite neutral in that regard, we may have the perception of economy or sort of plastickiness or synthetic. Another question that we have here is, can we simulate high humidity or heavy perspiration conditions with the Tactile system? The answer is yes. The Tactile system is intended to be used in a laboratory environment, and the conditions in which a material is in will change its physical properties. And so we encourage all of our users to collect tactile information on any materials in the same conditions we think they'll be used in the real world. So we try to mimic those conditions when we collect that data, so that we're capturing the feel as influenced by atmospheric conditions. Another question here, is SynTouch done market research on consumer preferences for wipes? Yes, we have. Is this information freely available? I think we'd like to start a private discussion regarding that. So there is some information that's available. There's some information that unfortunately is behind the curtain of an NDA. So we'd want to talk privately there. Another question, beyond consumer perception, are there ways to measure wipe-to-wipe interaction? For example, the tactile surface tension between the wipes that allow it to release of a wipe below it pop up, ? Sorry. If so, could we give more prediction for wipe dispensing? The answer is yes. If it's a physical measurement on sort of packaging or wipe-to-wipe interaction, we may be able to shed some light there. If this is something that relates to the human perception of what it's like as a person, pulls a wipe out of a packaging or a pop-up, I think that would be more relevant to Tactile. So maybe we could fill in the context a little bit more. Someone asked about the price range of the instrument and are there different models? The answer is there are not different models. There's only one model. We offer a number of different solutions. SynTouch is both a haptic service provider as well as we offer the instrument for both rental and purchase. Feel free to drop us a line and we can give you a quote if that's desired. Can the sensor detect the cooling effect of a phase change fabric? Yes, it can. As fabrics change over time, or as, let's say, a solution evaporates and you have sort of an evaporative cooling effect, that can be captured by our system. Someone has asked a great question, which is, what are the top attributes needed for from consumer for wet wipes, and that really is going to depend on your question. So we can help guide you and get you there, but I would kind of ask the question back of what's the goal? Are we trying to compare wipe A to wipe B? Are we trying to make our wipe feel exactly like the competitor? Where there's been either negative or positive feedback, and how we can guide it. So it's very important to consider that there will be some attributes or some things that are more important, more factors that are more important than others. However, we want to make sure we have the right context before we can say, in this case, yellow may be more important, and in some other application, blue may be the most important. So. Someone has asked, the coefficient of friction in dry and wet are quite different. So what measurements do you rely on? What about drag forces? How do you account for those in your predictive model? So we take measurements both in wet and dry states. Our Takari is designed to evaluate materials exactly in the same way that people do. And so if you can feel it, if you can tactily, pun intended, put your finger on it as to the sensation that you're trying to capture, we will be able to put objective data behind that sensation. So if you can feel a difference, if people can feel a difference between, say, sensation A and sensation B, friction A, friction B, there will be a reliable, repeatable way to put objective data behind that with the Takari. Another question here, since human touch is imprecise and subjective, how do we rely on a precise correlation with the instrument? Great question. We don't. We don't intend to precisely correlate what we would consider noisy, non-repeatable human data with precise, objective representation of the tactile data of the material. What we use the human data for is to guide us. We use the human data to drive the decision. We use that human data to say, okay, we understand that wipe A is preferred to wipe B in, say, 60%, 80%, 90% of the time. Why? We get to the bottom of that and we start to build which fundamental tactile components are responsible for that specific human response or that specific human interaction. Another question here, does SynTouch offer a service to evaluate materials? The answer to that is yes. We are a service provider as well as a equipment and solutions provider. Again, I'd encourage you to head over to syntouchinc.com/020 and we can start a dialogue there. Question here, does our service include conducting human panels? We can offer that to you, yes. Timeline for different services or for a study to get results, generally variable, but we do a lot of what we call discovery or pilot studies. Our goal is to be able to allow you to evaluate the service that SynTouch provides and answer one product question. And usually that's around 2 weeks from start to finish. So, but studies will range in timeline based on their objective. We've got a question here. What's the minimum sample thickness requirement for a sample? There's no minimum per se. We've tested things as fine as different products applied to things like human hair, or a couple of microns thick in terms of paint thickness, different types of coatings used in the automotive arena. In general, we would find that samples typically range from about half to about 1 millimeter, all the way up to around 70 to 80 millimeters. those aren't hard restrictions. We just tend to find that the majority of our samples fall within that thickness range. Another question here that says someone's struggling to figure out what's soft and what isn't soft, even though they may have some humans telling them that information. So we've got some. I'm assuming I'm gonna use a little bit of license here, and we've got some human data or perhaps some internal sensory panels telling us some things are soft and some things aren't soft. Soft, or for that matter, luxurious or comfortable, whatever the adjective may be, can vary, and it's going to vary based on the type of material that we're talking about, and it's going to vary on how we build that model. So internally, it may be a struggle. We may need to change the focus from an internal assessment of what soft is to a consumer perception assessment of what soft is. We may need to understand a little bit more about if there's some standards of excellence or failure that we can define. So if there are other materials, other examples of things that are soft, things that are smooth, things that are not soft, that we can bring into the equation, we can bring into the discussion and be able to do that. Folks asking about artificial skin substrates to mount the specimen on, and can we recommend one? Yes, we've worked with a number of different skin substrates, as have some of our clients. Can I recommend one? I think we'd want to build a dialogue around your application before we can help guide what may or may not yield the results that we're looking for in the application. But we definitely would like to continue the conversation. Folks asking about some published results. We have a sample study that's available on our website. We have a question here again specifically about ranking various wipes or materials on a softness scale. Again, softness is a subjective term, but this is something that we can build for you and can provide to you specifically, the person asking this question, as well as to this audience. It really just depends on what would you like to do with it. What's the goal? Again, what question is driving the desire for this scale, and then how do we add value? How do we activate the data that may be represented in a scale, and what do we go and do with it? So again, all really great questions that are certainly exciting for us here at SynTouch, and hopefully for all of you to go ahead and engage and start a dialogue with us, so that we can both learn more.